This is Chapter 19 of Drumlin Fever, named The Flood. The Warkworth Fair grounds, at first sight, do not compare with the garish domes and modern avenues of Toronto's Canadian National Exhibition. There is a racetrack, a grandstand, a judge's turret, the Warkworth Arena, and a two-story red exhibition building. But when fair time comes, there is a transformation. People make the fair, not the buildings. The same is true of the annual Donnybrook, the auction of everyone's barnstormed junk, or generous donations, as the case may be, which takes place at the end of June. The auctioneers give their services free, and the proceeds are for some worthy town purposes. For days ahead, volunteers go around collecting old chairs, bedspreads, bags of wheat or sacks of bulbs, jars of pickles, lamps, mirrors, and farm implements. There are many such Donnybrooks across Ontario, but no county has as many villages as Northumberland, nor has Northumberland any village to compare with Warkworth. It is even blessed by the nearness of religion, for at the very gates of the fairgrounds, those proud stone gates with the memorial tablets in brown, is St. John's Church. St. John's Church flourished in some remote past, when the sonorous notes of Cranmer's prayer book might have been heard through its simple Gothic windows. But its membership declined and preferred to drive to Campbellford. Church authority remote in Toronto thrice offered the building as a community centre, but those who wanted a community centre preferred, on the one hand, to always have a reason to raise money at the Donnybrook, and on the other to make plans to float a mighty blown and make various deals along the way. So by the time of the stirring events that befell the Scace children and the developers of Own Your Own Ontario, St. John's was occupied by the very Reverend Archimandrite Pavel Florovsky. In a long white beard and flowing black robes, incense came from the window cracks, strange chants were heard at early hours and late, and whether any people from Warkworth ever worshipped there is uncertain. There were even some nasty minds among those elderly citizens who congregated to exchange information, who threw doubt on just who was worshipped there. Such thoughts did not affect the dozens of people who moved through the fairground gates on this hot Saturday in June. Normally, the Donnybrook begins in early evening, when all the donations have been collected and the buyers are free from their chores and shopping and ploughing to gather round. But the influx of 200 visitors, or voyageurs, Bondworthy preferred to call them, and the total breakdown of the original plans made for them led to swift and useful compromises. The auctioneering would begin an hour earlier, and the auctioneers scattered over the country at frightful auctions were urged to finish their supper early and come. In the meantime, Cynthia and her Ontario for Youth shock troops had organized the 200 people into all kinds of games and activities. Feeding facilities had been set up in the exhibition building, and all the bread in Warkworth had been commandeered, along with all the jam and peanut butter. Bondworthy's logistics had broken down somewhere, and the caterers' boxes, when unpacked from the crippled buses and opened, had proved to contain only 100 sandwiches and 100 bottles of warm pop. The Pine Ridge Inn, whose restaurant usually provided good simple food for the wayfarer at a small margin of profit, suddenly had a boom. Ordinary operations were closed down entirely, while the staff made hundreds more sandwiches and many more dollars, all at the expense of the O development, not their guests. The Beehive and Perchards, and even Edwards Market in Norham, sent emergency cars and trucks to Campbellford for extra supplies, and the teenagers of that fair canal town, setting out to gossip at a corner or drive to Haley's Falls, or do some necking by the locks, found every outlet dry, and were forced to drink either water or milk, or raid the forbidden beer supplies of unsuspecting parents. The 200 voyageurs were enjoying themselves. They had, after all, been provided eventually with food along with Cynthia's kind of organized interference, which at least kept the children and teenagers busy, and above all, with the excitement of the flood. They would be when they returned to Painted Post Drive, Neapolitan Crescent, Manorhampton Place, Coquette Road, or Driftwood Park, their centre of attention. They, at first hand, had witnessed the explosion and flood that had held all Ontario spellbound before its TV sets, when the baseball games were interrupted with special bulletins and the Emergency Measures Organization at Caesarea, near Lake Scugog, mistaking the signal, had forced all the inhabitants from their homes and driven them into the midst of a decorous nudist conference in the reforested highlands near Uxbridge. When Harold Todesky had dragged Monworthy breathless through the crowd who were listening to the minister, he had really no idea what he could accomplish. He knew his charge was a very strong one, and that the fuse had been set for about 30 hours, but in any case, he had never meant to use that means of detonation. He grabbed Bonsworthy because he could not see Carl O'Donnell, the foreman, and he felt some degree of responsibility towards the company that had employed him. Perhaps by getting Bonsworthy to drive him to the scene, he might get enough yet smother the fuse. As he reached the fairground gates and began to explain to the now terrified Bonsworthy what the situation was, the remarks of the minister and then of the mayor came across the loudhailer with frightening loudness. The mayor's last word, "children," had no sooner been uttered than the explosion was heard by everyone, and Harold and his captive, already facing towards Main Street and Scace's Hill, not only heard the distant rumble, but saw a mushroom-like cloud of dust and smoke rise in the direction of the bypass highway. The roar and rumble continued, but the smoke just hung there. "The children," said Harold. "They must be those missing girls of Albert Scace's. I'll bet they're somewhere near the dynamite." "Oh, no," said Bonsworthy. "They couldn't be." "Why not? Don't children always go where they shouldn't?" "Oh, yes. I mean, if anything happens to them, I might be blamed." "Why so?" "I quarreled with their father." "Come quickly. Where is your car?" "Someone borrowed it to get supplies for the voyagers." "Damn the voyagers. They made a mess of everything." Harold was recollecting that he found the beer supply entirely gone at the liquor store. Well, by this time the crowd had started to run after them, leaving the minister floundering with the loudhailer, and Mayor Scace, anxious for his nieces, was running faster than most, even pushing some of the dodderers and slowpokes in his rent. His car was not far away, just by St. John's, and he called out to Tedeschi to hop in as he started, so Bonsworthy was left hardly able to stand, his little green hat in hand, his tie askew, utterly bewildered by events. A few other cars followed the mayor as he raced up Church Street, then Mill Street, and finally along the bypass highway. The spectators, on foot, followed as best they could, Cynthia abandoning a session with her OFY leaders, in which she was telling them how to handle mobs, simply raced, taking a shortcut across the concession road out to the bypass. Both city and town boys cheered her on, and the more daring or less easily winded raced after her. Thus it was that there were, at a few hundred yards distance, spectators on foot, when a small crowd of vehicles buzzing together at the locked Triple-O gate found a solution. Literally, an easy-going farmer who loved to drive his big truck everywhere and never seemed to have to do much with his land, shouted out, "Get those damn cars out of that way, I've got to rub the gate." He burst noisily along the highway, and the cars quickly moved away from the entrance to the verge, or where they could get to. He raced his engine, started off like an advertisement for a Detroit supercar, and drove straight through the gate. There wasn't even a second's delay. The truck cut us through butter, and the gate road draggled on top of the cab, the name Frost showing up like some lost and out-of-season weather forecast. The cars rushed in behind, and the running youngsters, still down the road with the distance, stopped long enough to cheer. When Cynthia and her runners reached the row of cars parked at the edge of the knoll that overlooked what had been Putnam's farm, but was now the site of the Triple-O Lodge, they found the men who had driven standing silent and motionless, looking at the confusion below. The small new lake was there, still in turbulence, with spouts of water coming up from place to place where there had previously been attempts to drive wells. Logs and fence rails were in the water, and there was still a roar of fierce water corrosion as the far end of the lake where the explosion had taken place. The rock stood above the waters at the fair edge, and there was yet a layer of dust hanging in the air. To the north, the water had rushed to and flooded the now empty farmhouse, and was lapping close to a parked car, which was in fact Skip Martin's, though the children onlookers didn't know it. There was some fear lest the water should break through in that direction and flood Warkworth, but the watershed was the other way, to the south, and the current was moving along the course of what had been Brian's dry riverbed, by which he had approached the spy on the Triple-O. But there was no sign of the water source now, only its direction and the water rushing along, overrunning the road, allowance at the culvert to join the salt river out of sight of the onlookers. Cynthia came behind Mary Scace. "Do you think the children were in that?" she whispered. "I don't know. I hope not," said Timothy. Harold. Was this area searched?" "Maybe. I was home at Rice Lake, you know, when the search began. Carl maybe did it." "Look, Mr. Scace," said Cynthia, "in the field beyond the big rock." What do you see?" "It's a man running. Can't make out who he is, though." Oh, I see. Look, it's more people." "It's kids," said Harold. "I think it's them of Albert's. The girls, you mean, the girls, all 4 of them. Phew, I hope I'm right." When they were satisfied that this little group in the distance was the Scace children, Timothy Scace led the others back to his car, giving lifts to the young runners. He first asked Letcherly to drive towards Norham to check whether the flooding would come up to the bypass, and then to warn some of the Norham folk with low-lying houses. He and Cynthia then went back to the fairgrounds, planning what to do next as they drove. One crisis at least seemed over, and those indeed were indeed the girls. But there were still visitors, and the minister, and the Donnybrook, and then there was the flood. An hour later, Dr. Coldwell had finished his examination of all 4 children. "Well, Bert and Mrs. Scace, there's nothing wrong with those 2 girls, but they told you, hunger. They show every sign of having fasted for 24 hours and eaten too many jam sandwiches before I got here. You really should have made them wait. Suppose it had been serious." He was plainly exasperated, as doctors often are, when they firmly expect their warnings and instructions never to be followed, even by parents. "But even that's even more extraordinary," said Thelma. "Whoever would have made them sleep so long?" "I don't know, and no one ever knows, or would ever know, unless it happens to them again. There couldn't have been any gas or anything like connected with dynamite. Not with the dynamite. There might have been with the fuse, but I doubt it. From what I gather from the boys, the girls were well separated from where the explosion charge must have been." "That's good, anyway. What about Kevin, Milton?" "Boy, Bert, that boy's been through considerable emotional strain. You think of the 2 of them that Brian would be the more highly strung, but all the tension's in Kevin." "Don't we know it?" replied Calvert. "Kevin's not really hurt physically. He's a bit bruised from jumping into the bushes to help the girls. All 4 of them had a lot of dust and smoke in their eyes. Now I want to talk to you a bit about Brian." "Brian?" "Yes, it seems he's been off his prescription for a couple of days." "Perhaps so, but he hasn't shown any sign of allergy or asthma since yesterday morning." "Well, I can't explain that, particularly if he's been off the drugs. But right now he's worse than ever, eyes pouring like a flood, rash on his hands, all choked up. I've given him a shot. Of the 4 of them, he'd better take it easy tonight. No Donnybrook. He'll be disappointed. I guess he'll have to stay home and watch TV. That might be worse than the Donnybrook. Anyway, he knows how to keep quiet." The telephone rang at this point, and Albert answered it. "Dr. Coldwell, right here." The doctor listened for a moment, suddenly hung up. "I'll have to go now. That fellow Bumworthy seems to have collapsed." Thelma stood at the door. "No comment," she said. Dr. Coldwell looked at her. "Don't like him, huh?" "No comment," and off he went. "Doctor," said Mrs. Yurichuk, who had been sitting out of sight, "they think they know everything, and they can't explain the girl sleeping or Brian being cured and then starting up again. Thelma, are you sure the children haven't been trying drugs at the school?" "Drugs, Mother? What a notion! Anyway, Brian's on drugs all the time. It's when he comes off the drugs that he's all right." Well, Albert put the 2 cents in. "Well, as Milton says, we'll probably never know. Perhaps he borrowed some of Kevin's surplus stress, and it was good for him." In the hours that followed till supper time, the girls played quietly with their dolls and books in their room, going downstairs regularly to get more food and drink. Meanwhile, Kevin and Brian both slept the afternoon away, released from their worries and unaware of the drama that was still gripping Percy Township. The Salt River did fill to its top, all the way down, but no houses in Norham were flooded. Photographers who had come to cover the case of the missing girls, having been shooed away by Bert and Thelma in the name of the children's peace, swarmed over the site of the explosion and took pictures of the new lake. A helicopter made a special visit to take pictures from the air. Then the press found the situation in Warkworth equally newsworthy, with the crowds of visitors, a special service truck from Coburg, trying to repair the tires of the buses, and the Minister of Municipal Affairs caught in the midst of the local drama. They decided to stay for the Donnybrook and hoped they would still get full credit for ample coverage. They had telephoned their home papers and broadcast stations, and they had been promised by Bert and the family, and rescue girls would come down to the auction. This is the end of Chapter 19 of Drumlin Fever.